tacos in my heart, they'd be warm right now. You guys are way good. And I appreciate everyone being here. There's people in the room and always better energy. But especially we have our new team leader, Jill Broderick here. Hello, Jill.
Hi.
And our owner, broker, et cetera, and so forth, OP, Mike Brody. And for him to take the time with everything on his plate to sit here, I'm very appreciative. Work through it. And we all have to pay homage to someone else who's usually in my class, either live or Zoom, and that's Charles Brazil. Thank you. Now, I just handed something out to you that we're not going to talk about first thing. It's actually second thing as we get into the loan thing, but it's a document that you didn't have in your normal package. What we want to talk about first, what you should have on your first page, it says BAC policy for KW Plano. Everybody have that? You know what that means? BAC? Fire Agent Commission. So when you look in MLS on the same line, you know, where it has, SAC, we never, ever, ever, ever do sub-agency. We'll never do sub-agency. And even if you talk to management about doing that, I'm going to recommend therapy for them if they agree to. Not ever do sub-agency, not in this marketplace. So Buyer Agent Commission, there's some number that goes in there. And we are going to firm up our policy. And we've got some factors here that come into play. One of the first things I want to make sure everybody understands about our policies. We have no arbitrary policies. All of our policies are well thought out, well vetted. They're based on experiences. They're based on things that we feel like this is what benefits the agents, the market center, and everybody. There's always a good basis for our policies. And so there's never, well, it's going to be that because that's what I said. We never, ever do that. That's not who we are. That's not how we do things. So when you have something like this, if you say, wow, I'm not sure I understand that. Well, then let's have the conversation because we've had the conversation. We've had it at the leadership level. We've had it with other brokers who don't make a decision about what our policy is, but it's good to know what's going on in the marketplace. So I have 5 factors here that come into play because our policy is that our agents, when they have a listing and they put it in MLS, regardless of what the listing commission is, they're required to offer up 3% to BAC. And that's our policy. So these are the factors that come into play there. One is just the perception of the marketplace. There is a perception in the marketplace. The expectation is 3% BAC, and most agents, when they put together a buyer rep agreement, we're going to talk about that towards the bottom of this page, they do that based on that they're going to get 3% from the other side. So that's kind of the norm. And so that's a factor. But having said that, you look at the second factor, and that's the impact on the showing of the property. In years past, an offering, a listing in MLS or otherwise that offered up less than 3% was not shown as well as a property that you offered 3%. It impacted on the showings. Now, it shouldn't. Sometimes it impacted on the showings because the agents wouldn't show up because, hey, it's not enough money for me, 2%, I don't work with that. But even if it's done correctly, even if a buyer's agent, and we'll see this at the bottom of this page, talks to the buyer and says, you know what? You agreed in the buyer rep to pay me 3%. Seller here is only going to pay me 2%. So you're going to owe that 1% if you want to pursue this property. And the buyer may say, well, let's hold off. Let's look and see what else is out there. Maybe I don't want to see this property quite yet because maybe I don't want to do that. We're going to talk about the decision for the agent and deal with that at the bottom of this page. But even done right, this could impact on it. Now, so it could do. Now, the third factor, impact on days on market. As I've done an analysis, and some of my agents, I don't know if she's on our Zoom call, Sally Meiser, if she's there or not, she did a really good job of pulling up some data from Netris. In our current market, and we could go back probably last year, there's no real correlation between the offering of BAC and days on market. with the seller's market that we're dealing with now, buyers agents, buyers don't look at that. Hey, if we can just get a contract on a house, that's what we want to do. So we don't see a correlation. In years past, there was a correlation. It did impact on the marketing property if you offered less than 3%. We don't see that as a major factor now as you work through that. The fourth factor, and also frankly the fifth factor, gets to be the reaction. If we have a situation where, gee, it doesn't affect the seller, it's not going to affect the sale of the property unless it's an unusual property, it's a hard to sell property, and then you want to make sure you offer up to everything you could. If it doesn't, then why can't we offer less? Why can't we offer 2 or 2.5, something like that? And maybe we have to do that to be able to get the listing at some lower number. And so they say, well, okay, if you do that because of the nature of the market today, what are you going to do 2 years from now when the market changes? Are you just going to keep shifting back and forth and whatever the latest thing is? No, because then you don't have a consistent policy. And you can't create a situation where, the seller understands when they take a listing, here's what they're going to have to pay out. And then negotiate that listing based on that knowledge. And if we're consistent across the board, then that helps our listing agents understand here's what's going to be involved as we negotiate our listing. Does that make semi-sense? So those are the factors that we looked at as we firmed up our policy, that if you're going to take a listing in MLS and otherwise, you're going to offer up 3%. So when you negotiate the listing with the seller, you need to be where you're going to do that. Now, we recognize, and I do this, I've got some of what I finally refer to as absolute rules. And I'm not totally crazy. Well, maybe I am. Anyway, I know that no one does anything 100% of the time. I understand that. But if you have a situation where you say, well, I just can't do that on this one, check with management, check with Jill or Mike or me, and let's talk about it and let's see if there's an exception. There's always a possibility for an exception. It's just like our standard is when you take a listing, charge 6%. But there could be a situation in which you're going to be representing the seller on a $200,000 piece of property and they're going to buy a $600,000 piece of property and you're going to negotiate something because you have both ends of that. So you may do something. And so we understand that there are exceptions. There are business decisions that you make that could change what the norm might be. And we want you to feel comfortable as we go through that process that we really thought through this and we got some factors. There's another little ego/emotional factor. There's a perception by many of us that an offering of less than 3% is an indication of the type of company that it is. And maybe they're a discount, flat fee, minimum service kind of company. We are clearly a full service brokerage and we operate at a very high level. And there is certainly a feeling on my part that an offering of anything less than 3% really impacts on our reputation in the marketplace. Now that's very subjective, and that's just how I think about it. It may not be how everybody thinks about it, but I think that's a factor. And I think we need to respect that. Questions on that? Thoughts on that? Comments? Is everybody pretty much on board saying, yeah, Bob, if we'd been in the room with you guys and talked about it, we would all agree. So that's good. Anything on the Zoom, folks? Are we good with all that? Everybody on board? Okay. And I always try to give a little time for everybody to unmute themselves and, whoa, Bob, slow down. We're going to talk about this. Now, let's look at the other conversation. This kind of deals with this whole 3% issue. At the bottom of this first page, because of what's going on in the marketplace. And we have right now 3 of our agents in MLS who are offering less than 3%. And as we finish with all of this, I'll have a respectful conversation with all 3 agents. One of them is offering 2%. She's an out of area property listing, and the other 2 are offering 2.5%. And as I do the search in Netris, that's all I came up with when I pulled up Collin County in our immediate area. So this is not a huge challenge for us. It's not like we've got half our agents who say, whoa, we're going to do this, because that's not what's happening. It still needs to be consistently addressed. But because when you pull up properties in MLS, a significant percentage of listing agents are offering less than 3. And you may or may not have received, if you haven't, send me an email. I'll send it to you, that list of builders and the variance on the builders and what they're offering. Some of them is, 1%, 2%. One of them is $7,000. The other is two and a half. One of them is actually at 4. So significant range of what the builders are doing out there. And because of that, when you enter into a buyer rep agreement with your buyer, in which the buyer in paragraph 11 agrees to pay you 3%, and your conversation with them is, that's probably going to be paid by the other side. The typical norm is we'll represent you and we'll get that 3% of the other side. In fact, you're obligated in paragraph 11B of that buyer rep agreement to be proactive and to attempt to obtain that money from the other side as part of the agreement. But given the nature of the market we're in and how many listing agents and other sellers, even for sale bonus, whatever, are offering less than 3%, you need to be prepared on the decision you're making with the buyer. Are you going to hold them to that 3%? Are you going to enforce it? Is the relationship such that you're going to say, whatever I'm offered, I'll take it. Whatever it is, we'll accept it. You've got to make that decision. You've got to decide on the degree to which you have that conversation. So the buyer understands, here's what I want to do. Now, if this is a buyer who you really, really want that buyer, it's a really good buyer, good price range, good everything, it'll be a good center of influence for you. You may say, it's an investment. If I only get 2% or 2.5%, I'll take that because of the relationship with the buyer and do it. Another buyer who you're kind of iffy about whether I'm going to really take that buyer or not, you might be a little tougher with them. And if it runs them off, you may be okay with that. So you've got to make a judgment call early on in that relationship with that buyer on what you're going to do. But you do need to have the conversation. You need to understand that whether you have the conversation or not, you're making your decision. In my opinion, it's too late to make the decision when it turns out that they want this for sale by owner property and the for sale by owner is only going to pay you 1%. That's probably the wrong time to be talking, you got to pay the other 2. You need to probably have already had that conversation. Does that make semi-sense? Okay, good. Okay. So those are our 2 in which we're firming up the policy on the 3% rule. And here's something you need to really address. Now, the other thing, I just handed out to you a handout that says forbearance issues. The next page talks about appraisals. We want to make sure we're on board with rules on appraisals, conventional FHA, VA, that type of thing. Forbearance, we're not seeing a lot of this. Have any of you had a listing where the seller had done forbearance? Does anybody have that yet? Okay, Kyle's had one. Okay, good. I think we're going to see more of this as the pandemic is waning down and people have done the forbearance where they've taken their payments and either had them not adjusted like a loan modification, but they had them move towards the end, work something out with their lender. We're going to see that happen more. And you need to understand the concept of what's involved and what happens. And you see the factors here. It's different depending on the type of loan on the seller's house. Because what we're concerned with, what forbearance essentially does, is impacts on the payoff. Our problem is the timing of obtaining that information. If it's conventional, it depends a lot on the lender. Some lenders are really good and you can get it in a couple of days. Some of them it's longer than that. Very few of them are like a payoff on a car or something where you just got to get it the same day. But there is a timeline. In a conventional loan, not a big deal. Huge challenge on FHA and VA. FHA and VA go through an organization, NOVAD, and who makes the request for the payoff is going to be the title company. They don't make the request until they have the title commitment, which is typically 5 to 7 days after they have a copy of the contract. And so they make the request, and the organization is going to provide that request. They're really busy right now. And they have, as a minimum, 5 to 7 business days, and more typically 14 business days. Now, where this comes into play is if you've got a seller who has an FHA loan that's going to be paid off, and they've got multiple offers, and they're looking at this one offer that's a cash offer that's going to close in 10 days. Oh, no, it won't. won't be able to obtain a payoff in 10 days. It just won't happen. We'll have to threaten people and bribe people and all kinds of stuff like that. It probably won't happen. So your seller needs to understand there are some factors here that could be involved. Now, you're going to have that conversation with your seller in a very positive rapport building manner that increases your value proposition because you know of things that could affect that seller. But I promise you, the other agents haven't talked about, they probably aren't aware of. That just could really impact on which offer they accept. And certainly, if they've got a conventional payoff deal, it's a much better thing. They probably could close in 10 days. If it's FHA or VA, it just won't happen. And you need to be aware of that, and they need to be aware of it. It's going to be a factor in getting the deal done. So if you find yourself on the listing, and it's a question, it's a reasonable, respectful question, is as we come together and as I work up your net, and part of the net's going to be including your payoff, and your payoff would be impacted by anything you've done on your loan, such as loan modification, forbearance, and of that nature. And so if you've done that, let's talk about how that might impact on your payoff and the timing of that, because I'm familiar with that and I can help you with it. And I promise you, they haven't heard that from anyone else, because the other agents just don't know how it works. And you do. You at least going to have a conversation with a good title company, and they're going to explain to you, well, here's our process, here's what we do, here's when we find out about it, and here's how we go through that. So it's going to be one of those things that I think it will enhance, because I do believe over the next year, we're going to see more of these. We're going to see more people that it comes out of the woodwork that they really have done something to their current loan because of the pandemic, and we're going to find ourselves doing that. And you don't need to be surprised, and they don't need to be surprised. Just they don't need to be accepting an offer that they just can't close on because of the payoff. Questions on that? We good, everybody?
Bob, I have a comment. This is Laura.
Yeah, Laura. Yes, ma'am.
It's not forbearance, but we need to be aware of the fact that this also impacts reverse mortgages.
Yes, it does. In fact, it's interesting, Laura, you bring that up on reverse mortgage. Unfortunately, the same group, Novad, also processes the reverse mortgage unless it's a conventional. If it's an FHA or VA reverse mortgage, if it's conventional, then the lender deals with it. And you're absolutely correct. You've got to deal with the payoff on a reverse mortgage. And again, you could have a timing situation where generally, more sellers are aware of the fact that they're in a reverse mortgage. The problem with forbearance is many sellers, oh, I thought that was forgiven. I didn't think I had to pay that back. What, I've got to pay that back? When did this happen? You'd be surprised how many sellers that's what they think it is, because lack of communication. But you're exactly right. On reverse mortgage, you have to deal with that. And depending on the lender, if you're dealing with one of the big ones, because Novad also is a consulting firm, and they also have reverse mortgages. And if they've got it, which they would on any kind of Fannie Mae, Freddie Mac loan, then you'd have to deal with that. So that's a very good point, Laura. Thank you for bringing that up. Excellent. Anything else anyone has on that before we move to the appraisal issue? Remember, you just left us. You just got up and just left. Do you do that a lot? Yeah, But you know what? He's royalty, so we live with it. Okay, and this is a fairway sheet. And let's talk just quickly about this. We've had a number of scenarios where people weren't sure about appraisals and how they stayed with the property or not stayed with the property. An appraisal done on conventional does not stay with the property and is confidential information. So if a property was appraised and the seller ended up with a copy of that appraisal, and that may be the reason that the deal fell apart and the buyer went away, there's no obligation for the seller to provide that appraisal or that information on the appraisal to the next buyer. There's no obligation to provide that. And that's confidential information. Now, FHA, we talk about the FHA process here, it stays with the property. So if the next buyer is FHA, then they're going to use that appraisal is transferred to that buyer. But if they're going for a conventional VA, then they get a new appraisal. So it depends on what's going on with the buyer, whether or not that FHA appraisal is something that has to be dealt with. VA does not stay with the property, it stays with the veteran. So this veteran's going to make use of, for whatever reason, this appraisal on this property or whatever, stays with him, but if the next veteran or whatever comes in, they're going to get a new appraisal. Because you've got different kind of scenarios with different financing, you need to have a little bit of a sense on what happens appraisal-wise. Question on that? Working through it? Now, a form that you've only seen a couple of hundred times, 150 times in my classes. You probably read the 7-page document that I created explaining this. Now, okay. Now, what I want to talk about on this is really the second choice, a partial waiver. This is the one I get the most questions on. And while I get it some from new agents, I get this more often from experienced agents. And by the way, do me a favor, when you call and talk to me, I'm always very respectful. I'm glad you gave me a call. I'm glad to help out. Try to avoid saying at the very beginning, first of all, don't say quick question, because it never is. Second, don't say, well, Bob, I've never had this before. I had one of our experienced agents use that. And he'd had 3 of them. I knew he did 3. I don't know why. I said, well, I've never had this before. So, but what it is, he just forgot. He didn't remember what it was. So try to be a little nice. But here's our challenge with the second one. Because we're clear on the first one. Buyer totally gives it up. Says, hey, if the appraisal is a problem, I don't get to do anything because I've waived that totally 100%. Of course, your conversation, you've got the buyer to make sure, hey, you understand what you're really doing here? Following up with a good email. Here's what you're doing. You better have the money. I just had this conversation last night. And it's one of the reasons that I said, boy, I really do need to talk about this. Our agent, $925,000 sales price. And use this addendum, second choice, and put for this $925,000 sales price, put $875,000 in there. He did not understand his buyer just committed to $50,000 of an appraisal gap. If the property appraised for $875,000 or more, buyer had to cover the gap. He said, oh, I thought it was related to the list price. No, it has nothing to do with the list price, has nothing to do with anything except the appraised value and the number you put here. So from your standpoint as a buyer, here's the simple concept is so incredibly simple. Here's how you back into it. Your buyer's going to offer, say, $925,000. And your buyer says, I'm willing to cover some of the appraisal gap. I'm willing to help the seller feel good that if it doesn't appraise for the $925,000, I'll cover the gap up to a certain amount. Whatever that number is, the buyer says, I'll cover up to $10,000. You take the $10,000, you subtract it from the $925,000, you get $915,000. That's the number that goes in number 2. Under 2II, that's what goes in there. $915,000. If it appraises for that or more, the buyer has to cover the gap. So whatever the buyer is willing to cover, you subtract that from the sales price. You put it here. It has nothing to do with the list price or anything else. And there's no obligation for the buyer to pay more than the sales price, which is in paragraph 3C of the contract. He's capped on that. All he's doing here is saying, I'll cover a gap. Here's how much I'll cover it for, whatever it is. Now, in the example that I just gave, $925,000 sales price, the list price was $900,000. And we have some docs in the back. So grab the docs in the back so you can follow along because I'm talking about lots of good stuff here. Thank you so much for being in here. Appreciate it. So $925,000 sales price, $900,000 listing. And the listing agent was very upfront, says, I don't think this has any hope of being appraised for the list price. Because I agreed to list it for more because that's what seller wanted to do. We'll be lucky if it appraised for $870, $880. And our agent said, oh, oops. how much of a gap is my buyer committing to? Well, up to $50,000 in his original conversation. Now, and this listing agent is one of my best agents in Rockwall, head of one of my best teams, very experienced. And he sent back kind of an encounter to the buyer, our buyer's agent here, indicating that a seller would really be good with a waiver at the $900,000 level, list price level. That's to the advantage of our buyer. Our listing, that listing didn't understand it. So in my next class there, which will be like next week, we're going to talk about this again. Because we obviously have some people there who missed that. Ooh, I just gave away $25,000 of my seller's money and helped the buyer out there. So for whatever reason, and I think Marcia is right, says, there's a mindset, there's some kind of a mind block here. Then we look at this addendum, it just fogs out. We go, wow, I guess it's not even written in English. I don't know what this is. I'm like, what are we talking about here? And it does. So I want you to keep it. He does that.
Math. No, I just said it's math.
It's the math. Well, here's the math. Take the number the buyer's willing to cover, subtract it from the sales price. That's what goes in this paragraph. And that's it. And buyer needs to understand if it appraised for this or more, I'll cover the gap up to the sales price. And that's it. And essentially to make it more complicated than that, we need to avoid doing that because that's really all that is. That makes semi-sense? Questions on that? Yeah, there will be, but that's okay. And I want you to know, I give people a hard time about it. Marcia and I both joke about it a lot. But it's why we're here. Because, one of my favorite phrases, everyone is ignorant about something. I had somebody who was trying to show me how to steps in technology. We're going to do this, and then you go to this page. I said, here's my problem. If there's anything on that next page I go to that's different than what you just said, if it's a different color, I won't know what to do. I am ignorant about that. And so I understand that when you look at something, I go, well, I don't know how you make that more clear. Well, somebody else will look at it and says, wow, I really don't know what that means. Understand that. All have a different way. There's no way you can have any, especially written communication, which is one-way communication, such that everyone's going to see the exact same thing. That's why a little bit later, given our time, we'll talk about the repair amendment and how we need to really, really be clear on that. So we give this appraisal in. Okay. Next page is the coming soon requirement. This is just a quick down and dirty rule that just gives you here the simple steps in coming soon. The big thing is that, and we were talking about this on the next page, which has right out of NETRIS, the clear cooperation rules. The big challenge, the big thing here is coming soon is 30 days maximum and no showings to anyone, not somebody in our office, not to your best friend, not to anyone, period, in the conversation. You do, and there's some complaints filed, there'll be fines. So that's the two big things. Now, the variables are endless, but when it goes into coming soon, you're marking the property now. You put a sign in the yard, you can mark it, you can do all those kinds of things because it's an MLS. Your cooperation no longer applies. You've got an MLS. There's some limitations, which is when it's coming soon, it won't upload to realtor.com, it won't upload to Zillow. I mean, there's some limitations on what happens there, but you can market it, you can do whatever. Now, the other thing, and we're having this, it seems to have increased. We're having more sight unseen offers during coming soon. So when you list the property and because your seller doesn't want to do showings yet, they're getting the house ready and whatever else, doesn't matter. You need to have the conversation with sellers. Okay, what do you want to do when we get an offer sight unseen? They know they can't see the property and they want to make an offer. What do you, the seller, want to do about it? Do you want to receive the offer and look at it and think about it? Because seller, my obligation under the law, and Liz under the law, and they're both tracking an in-air code of ethics. I have to submit all offers I receive to my seller unless they instruct me otherwise. So I have to do that. So seller, do you want me to submit those offers to you and you entertain? Because you have a right to entertain them, to look at them, to counter it, to accept them. You have a right to enter into a contract with a buyer who's never seen the property. You've got that right. Let's talk about the risk, and we'll go through that process, and we'll talk about a form that we have in our office. It's called a pre-market advisory form, that if our seller accepts an offer and enters into a contract prior to it being fully on the market, they have to complete this. Because it tells them you could almost certainly get more money if you put it on the market. We understand you can decide not to, sign here. So you have to use that form. But our seller has the right to do it. Now, our seller has the right to say, I don't want to do anything. I don't want to see offers. Let's wait till it goes active, and then I'll look at whatever comes in then. They give you that written instruction, such as an email. So when a buyer's agent sends you an offer, you can send back, say, you know what? My seller has instructed me, they don't want to see this. So they'll never see this offer. Thank you for your interest. And as soon as it goes active, which we plan on doing that, whatever the time frame is, we're happy to receive your offer. But right now, seller won't see it. And that's a decision the seller made. It's a decision the seller had the right to make. But you've got to have that conversation. Don't wait till you get one and then go say, well, what do you want to do? I don't know. What are you talking about? Have the conversation now. By the way, all these conversations you're having, you're doing it in a very positive, rapport building way. Seller needs to know what he can do. He needs to know his options. He can agree to, accept sight unseen offers. He can tell you he doesn't want to see them. He can do all those things. He's got those choices. He needs to know what those choices are. You need to have that rapport building conversation with him. That enhances your value. Because I promise you, the other agents and other companies are not having that conversation. And so it's a real plus to our clients that you trained and that you have that knowledge. So I think that's good. Yes, ma'am, Barbara.
Wouldn't it be best in that incident if you receive an offer and the buyer has seen it sight unseen, and the seller says, I don't want to see it, but you've actually received it in your email? Wouldn't it be best ahead of time for the seller to actually give you something in writing?
Oh, absolutely. At least an email. At least an email.
Okay.
Good point. At least an email from our seller saying, now that I understand my options, thank you very much for explaining them to me. You must be a really good agent. And you smile, say, well, I am.
Over
So
email?
Yeah. And so you get, he says, so my decision is, if you receive offers sight unseen, and all the offers during the coming soon will be sight unseen. You receive offers, I don't want to see them. And you have the authority, my authority, to tell a buyer's agent, I'll not see that offer. We'll be happy to entertain it when it goes active, but right now, won't see it. And so that written instructions in an email from your seller is sufficient.
And you just have it parked in your email
Yep.
until it.
Absolutely. So you
Okay.
just do that.
Okay.
So that will be best service to our client and best service to you to make sure, because the buyer's agent is going to question, whoa. You know what? Imputed notice, imputed knowledge, you've got it, your client had it. Well, not in this case. Because that prevails. His instruction to you prevails over imputed knowledge, imputed notice. So he said, he's told you, no, don't have it. So that's an important thing. So we good with the conversation you've got to have with your seller and dealing with the coming soon issue and work through that.
I have a question.
Yes, ma'am.
So for this kind of scenario, so actually legally he can see it. It's just the seller doesn't want to show it. It's for the benefit of the seller.
He can do what?
Can the seller show it before it comes to the market?
Okay, so if it's in a coming soon,
Yes,
can the seller show it?
yes,
The answer is no.
actually, no.
No, because the rules of coming soon, as set forth in the rules in Netris, which is under NAR, showings are prohibited by anyone.
I see.
And see anyone as full caps, underlined, bold print,
I see.
and which means seller. And in the listing agreement, the seller agrees. Can't do that. You're not allowed to do that. That puts them in violation, us in violation of. Now, having said that, we understand people have lives. And the scenario, and we have one of these, where the buyer who was interested in the property knew the seller and was coming to a backyard barbecue that the seller's holding. Is that buyer going to see the house? Well, yeah. Can we say, oh no, come, you be in the backyard, you can't be, you got to stay out of the house, can't do it. because it's coming soon, we can't be sure. No,
No barbecue for
no
you?
barbecue for you. No, they didn't do that, and we understand, and maybe the seller's having a garage sale and somebody comes in. We just had the situation where there were contractors working on the property, and a potential buyer came in and was kind of walking around, and the contractor took him in and showed him the house. Things happen. We have no control over life, just like that. But we're clear, we don't want to initiate anything, we want our seller to understand, don't do this. But when your seller has that Thursday night poker party and people come and one of them may be somebody interested in property, they're gonna see the house. That's just the real world. We deal with that. Just, try not to let it be you doing it, because who'll come after us is our competition. They'll file complaints. Because, in this market that we're in now, it's not just us. Realtors are chopping at each other, and it's unfortunate. It's gotten to where they're sniping at each other. And I think it's because we've got a bunch of realtors out there who are stressed, who are new in the business, who don't understand how things work, and they're just looking for problems. So be very careful. Don't let you be the one gets caught. Question on this. Now, the next page at the bottom there, we have the clear cooperation, and these are the rules from NAR that's in Netris, section 7 there, under our listing procedures. And we need to separate, there's a tendency to pull together coming soon and clear cooperation. Two different timelines. What we're dealing with in coming soon is properties in MLS. You've got an MLS. Clear cooperation addresses property that's not yet in MLS, but somebody does something to publicly market the property. Then the clear cooperation rule kicks in. The NAR concept of clear cooperation. They say we've got MLS, we have subscribers, we have people who pay to be in MLS. And so if you've got a property that you are thinking about or know about or whatever, you've got to share it with the other subscribers to MLS. And if you don't, we're going to fine you. And it starts at $1,000 and goes up from there. And that's the concept of it. So if you've got a piece of property that's not an MLS, you cannot expose it to anyone outside of our office. And our office, we've got that internal marketing thing, very confidential, access, form, sign, so forth. As long as you keep it within our office, our agents, you're okay. Once it's publicly marketed by anyone, including the seller, we start telling his friends about, we're not putting on the market yet, but you see, no. So one business day to get an MLS. So anything, any way, shape, or form, anybody does any public marketing, which talking about it on social media, certainly no sign in the yard, not doing anything that causes anyone outside of you, the listing agent, or other agent in our office to have knowledge of it, violates the NAR clear cooperation rule. So one is before MLS, the other it's an MLS. Different set of rules, but it's an MLS at that point. We're kind of semi-good with that. Now, gotten better at this. We went through a cycle. Agents were writing checks almost every day because they didn't do a very good job on the repair. What they were wording, what the buyer thought they were asking for, what the seller thought they were agreeing to, wasn't the same. And one of the realities is when there's a dispute between the buyer and the seller on repairs and things aren't done, the buyer and the seller begin to look to their agent, fix the problem. And the fix for the problem is money. So when the buyer, and we got going on right now, when the buyer has language in the repair amendment that's not good and addressed to the AC, but then the AC is not done the way the buyer thinks it should be done, and there are problems, and it costs more money after closing, all kinds of problems. It's going to come back on how we wrote the repair amendment, how we did that. And we got a concept in here that we'll talk about. We'll talk about some examples of language, but the first thing you have here is the amendment form. Please take time to read this form. It's only got 9 items on it. It's got 8 pre-printed. And if you have a situation that involves any of those 8, please check that box and use it. What we see way too often is they're going to extend the option period, which is number 6, but they stick it down to number 9. Now, that's not illegal. It's not a default situation, but frankly, it's, in my opinion, it's an agent who's not paying attention, who doesn't know what the form says. He's got it in the wrong place. The other thing is, not only did they put it in 9, the buyer also didn't pay the option fee. And notice, for the extension of the option fee is paid to the seller, not the title company. The original option fee is paid to the title company. For an extension of the option period, it's paid to the seller. That's what it says in item number 6. Now, doesn't mean the parties can't change that, by the way. Or vice counsel holder. But you need to understand, if you're going to extend it, technically you really need, the buyer really needs to pay that addition. It's usually a small amount, $1, $10, something like that. But put it in the right box, put it in number 6, make sure you've done that and done it correctly. Because if your buyer is going to extend it for another 3 or 4 or 5 days, and they terminate under that extended option period, it's going to be really important. The seller says, you know what? You don't get to do that. I never got that $10. You don't have an extended option. It's too late now. I said, whoa. I don't want to buy the house because you didn't do this and this way. If you don't close, you're going to lose your earnest money. Thanks for $5,000. So you need to make sure it's done correctly, and it's done completely, and work through the process. And the challenge we've got in this extension in payment to the seller is what we used to have with getting that option fee to the seller or listing agent, getting that coordinated, and so just to the title company now is a easier deal. But you need to make sure you get that worked out. Because, and by the way, this is only a factor if the buyer wants to terminate during that extended period. If they don't terminate during the extended period, it doesn't matter. We don't care. An important principle, and I just went through this again with one of our sister KW offices and had to get their broker involved. And at first he kind of was, I don't think that's right. Doesn't sound ethical. If a buyer doesn't pay an option fee, what happens? No option. What does happen? Nothing. Nothing else happens. The offering of an option fee in the contract is not an obligation. It's literally an offering. And if the buyer doesn't pay that option fee, the language in paragraph 5 is very clear in the contract. Here's what happens. Buyer doesn't have a termination option. Now, if the buyer doesn't pay earnest money as agreed, the language is different. Buyer's in default, and so I can go to paragraph 15, the default paragraph, and can do different things. But on the option fee, all that happens is the buyer's lost it. Now, I want you to think about that from the listing agent standpoint. Your seller's looking at multiple offers. And one of the offers they really like is a cash deal with a $20,000 option. And would you have, Mike, $1 million option fee?
Wasn't mine personally, but I know of one.
But yeah, so here's the key. So I say, oh, I like that, $20,000, that's great. Well, guess what? You may not get it. And the buyer's not required to give it to you. And if they don't give it to you, all they've lost is termination option. You don't get to sue them. Well, where's my $20,000? Well, don't get it. So when the seller decides he wants to accept that offer with a really good option fee, he may never get that money because if the buyer doesn't use that particular provision to terminate, to use something else, you just don't have to terminate, then they don't have to pay the option fee. So you just need to understand what happens with that in the contract. Now, for repairs, typically you're going to address repairs, paragraph 2. And one of the things that we sometimes get into trouble doing, try to scrunch it all in there. Please don't do that. You got 10 items. Don't try to scrunch it all in there. We have one agent that not only wrote it in here, wrote it down the column, wrote it down the margin, trying to fill it all in. No. Paper's cheap. Get another piece of paper, repair it. In fact, and what you really want to see in number 2 is see attached repair. Exhibit A, repair amendment, just do it all there, nice prioritized, number it out, signature blocks on the bottom. So it's very clear and specific what you've done as you work through that. So if you're doing a repair situation, you can do it right there. Now, there's nothing that keeps us from using number 9 to expand on repairs. You could do number 2 and number 9. You could be expanding other modifications. You could be expanding on the repair request in 2 and in 9. You could make sure you do that. Try to use the appropriate boxes that are already there in the pre-printed, because in every case, the reason all these things are here is over many years, the Burglary Committee said, here's something that keeps happening that causes the parties to need to amend the contract. It happens so often, we need to go ahead and have it as an item. We need to go ahead and have it on the list. If it's something that just rarely ever happens, then, in fact, before we had option periods in Texas, we didn't have number 6 because we didn't have an option period. So we didn't have an extension of an option period. But then over time, these things were added. So everything there is there for a reason and a purpose. You're saying, yeah, they keep doing this. If they want to change the closing date, if we want to change the third-party finance time frame, want to change the dollar amounts or price, whatever. Here it is, right here. We good? Questions on that? Question on the Zoom, folks? We got anything? We good? Now, repair amendment concept, next page. These are not casual or concepts to be taken lightly. These are concepts you should have at the front of your mind when you're writing a repair. You should be prepared for whatever you write being misunderstood by the other side. You need to, I've got to figure out some way to do it. Like, and I know it's not always logistically possible, but if you've got time, when you write a repair amendment, of course, make sure your buyer looks at it and ask your buyer, says, I just want to make sure what you think you're asking is what we've got here. Then have someone not involved in the transaction read it and see what they think you just said. They say, well, that's kind of, it looks pretty technical. I'm not sure what that means. Well, maybe we need to take a new look at it, working through it. So it needs to be clear. To whatever degree. And they need to understand what we're asking. Because you can ask for some things and they go, we just have one. And their reference was to certain sections of the inspection report. And when you look at those sections of the inspection report, the inspector made comments that were incredibly vague and weren't specific on what the problem was. So referencing to that in the inspection report was not helpful as you work through that. So you just make sure it's understandable. When you reference something, make sure it makes good sense. And make sure that it's correct, what you're asking. And windows are a good example. When you've got window repairs that the buyer is asking the seller you need to replace or whatever the language will be, doing that. Make sure you're very clear and specific. Which windows are we talking about? That the buyer, because the buyer's sitting there thinking, I want all the windows fixed. There are a bunch of windows with the seals broken. You can tell by the fogging. I want all that done. No. You got 3 in the master bedroom. You got 1 in the other. Whatever the location is, you have to be very specific. Here are the windows and what it is you want to be done with those windows and who you want to do it. Because I promise you, the seller in most cases is going to keep it down to as minimum as he has to do. Yes, ma'am.
Can you attach photos?
As long as the photos give you the location.
Okay.
Just a picture of a window may not tell me which window it is, but
Yes,
that's a good
picture
added.
of a window.
Yeah,
red
and
circle
then
around
here's the
it.
script. So that's a good added thing. Yeah, it's good. And then complete, make sure you've covered everything. Make sure as you go through and you dealt with it, that you've done everything you need to do in case there may be any questions or whatever. So these 4 concepts, this is, by the way, not just 4 concepts that are valid and really good for you in a repair amendment. These are really good for you when you're writing an offer. These same concepts, when you write an offer and what your buyer is offering to a seller, follow these same concepts. Because you want to make sure the other side understands. And sometimes you'll have to explain the real pluses, the benefits of your offer to the listing agent. You want to understand all of it. So you may have to go through that. So try to write it in such a way that it's as clear as possible going through that. Now, I've got some things here about repair amendment language, some things here. And the concept, we just dealt with these 4 things as you work through it. One of the concepts, what you'll do with your buyer, as you're looking at a request, is they need to prioritize. You know, here are the things that are most important. Because often you'll make a request and here are 10 items the buyer wants the seller to do. And so I said, well, I won't do all of those. I'll do some of those. If you got them prioritized, then it's easy for the seller to say, well, okay, I'll do these first 5. Those may be the ones that are most important to the buyer. So you can negotiate going through that. So prioritize. And you normally are dealing with situations that are either cosmetic. Sometimes the cosmetic can be really important. Trying to remember if anybody has, Scott may or may not have remembered. When did you start in the business?
In the business?
Yeah.
1994.
Okay, it was just a little bit before that. There was a property down in Canyon Creek. And everybody just joked about it, just laughed about it. They called it the Orange House. Now you would appreciate this because who was the college for the sellers? Orange. It was orange. I mean, it was, the cabinets were orange, wallpaper was orange.
Nothing wrong with that.
Oh, well, okay, but here's the problem. No, orange. I mean, you just walk in and go, oh my gosh. Well, the problem was everybody was laughing about that. That's crazy. And nobody's going to buy it. I mean, and it was a good price, you know, great location, all those kind of things. And finally, an investor said, we can fix the orange. That's not a problem. We can fix the orange. And he bought it, fixed the orange, and turned around and sold it and made a lot of money. And everybody else sitting around looking like idiots. The orange, they talked about, joked about the Orange House. Well, not a problem. You can fix that. So many of the cosmetics, which are really, really important, and in some cultures are very eclectic. They have a lot of colors, very dramatic colors, which can really impact on how the property is viewed, how people see it. Well, that can all be resolved, can all be taken care of. It's just cosmetic. Figure out what it is, what you need to take care of. So that's one of the areas. The other are functional areas. Things that are going on with the functional. And we know about the big ones, foundations, roofs, AC, plumbing, electrical, things like that. Anything that's brought up in the inspection that's a functional issue that we need to make sure we can address and deal with it. The buyer generally should focus on the functional issue. And the concept, question the buyer needs to ask themselves. How does this impact on me living in the house, on me using the house? If I'm going to live in this house, how does this roof leaking or how does this AC not working? How does this foundation choke? How does it actually impact on how I can live in the house? And if it has big impacts there, it's got to be resolved. It's got to be taken care of and deal with that. If it's something that says, you know what, I'm okay with it. It doesn't become a lender required repair. I can work through it. In fact, I've got a company that does this kind of thing and we can do it better and cheaper after I own the property than what we're at here because it should work through it. So but functional should be the priority for buyers who work through that. We're looking at these kinds of things. One thing, by the way, is an interesting thing, more so in the cosmetic than the functional, although, you know, we understand there are a whole lot of buyers who say, you know, foundation, big issue, scares me to death, won't even touch it. But on the cosmetic side, a seller needs to understand if he's got some serious cosmetic issues, outdated counters and carpet and things like that, the rule is a buyer, particularly an investor buyer, will discount the value of the property by more than it costs to fix the problem. And so your seller needs to understand, you know, if you could take care of these things, it would be a much more cost-effective thing than to let a buyer discount it for more than it's going to cost to fix it. We had a situation down it was East Dallas, and there was a neighborhood that older, you know, national houses, and it was going through a conversion. This is back in the 70s when most houses didn't have central AC, didn't have central heat and AC. And this neighborhood was going through a transition, and about half the houses had been converted to central AC, and the other half hadn't. And what we discovered is to confirm the point I said, the houses had not yet been converted were discounted by more than the cost of converting it to the central AC. And part of it's just a hassle factor, something like that. We want it already taken care of and already done. That's a repair amendment language. So we've got some examples on that next page in dealing with phrases like repair and replace. What we need to understand, and AC is a good example, where a buyer will say, we want the AC evaluated, serviced, and repaired as necessary. Now, for a long time, that felt like a fairly good, complete little phrase. Yeah, want you to service it, want you to fix it if it needs to be, and if it can't be fixed, we just want to do it. Well, that's not what you said. Even worse, what you said is you gave someone else the ability to make a decision on what's going to happen. And so the buyer may say, okay, may have two steps in here. Buyer may say, we want the AC to be evaluated by an AC company we approve of, or even name, we want Happy AC, we want, which is, by the way, an actual company, we want them to do it. And then based on their report, the buyer may then be specific on what they're requesting the seller. Okay, he's evaluated it, and it's low on Freon. One of the things that amazes me, by the way, and I know I'm not an expert in AC. That's just right, happened 3 weeks ago. No Freon at all. There's a leak. If you have low Freon or you have no Freon, there's a leak. I don't care what you say, Freon doesn't just evaporate. There's a leak, and it wasn't addressed. So now the buyer is demanding a whole new system. But it should have been the language that, fortunately in this case, we had a seller, but the seller accepted the language. The language the buyers had in there was vague enough and didn't address a leak issue. It should have been done there. So you need to be very clear. And if you need to go through a two-step process where it's evaluated by someone that the buyer is comfortable with, and then the buyer says, okay, here's what we know now. Here's our information on the condition of the AC or the water heater or whatever. So here's what we want to specifically have done. When you do that two-step like here, the buyer now has very clear, specific information that you're asking of the seller. So here's what we want to have done. You work through that. Without doing that, you're giving the other side the ability to make decisions on what's going to be done. And even good sellers have a tendency to want to cut corners and do something a little less expensive. And we hear contractors all the time say, well, we told the seller, we evaluated, we do all these things. And the seller's like, no, just do this. We don't need to do all the rest. They just do this. And that's classic. We have that happen all the time.
Bob,
Yes, sir.
are you talking about addressing those two steps within the First Amendment or a second amendment once you get the results from the?
Good question. It'd be in the First Amendment. And here's an important part of an amendment. Sometimes a transaction will have multiple amendments. And the rule is on an amendment is that each amendment stands on its own unless it addresses a specific item of a previous amendment. And then it's the timing of the amendment that prevails. So you'll never have an agreement to the same thing in multiple ways. The latest, most recent one will in fact prevail. So in this case, you do the first one where you want to evaluate it. And then once you have the information, you do a second amendment. Here's what the buyer wants to have done. Now, to be able to do that, you obviously are going through this whole process early on, not on the last day of the option period, not on afternoon of the last day of the option, which happens way too often. And frankly, listing agencies go ballistic on that. You guys do. You say, you know what, we just finally got it. 4:30, last day of the option period. What do we do now? Well, what do? When you represent the seller and you get the repair amendment at 4:30 on the last day of the option period, what do?
Go with the seller.
What?
Go through with the seller.
Yeah, present it to the seller, go through with the seller. And, your seller if he's available, you can do that, you can go through the process, it may not be, but hopefully if you're in the last day option, you made those arrangements to make sure your client, and they can make some decisions. The challenge then is going to be on the buyer side. Your seller, 10 minutes, say, okay, yeah, good, thanks for the information, not doing anything. Not gonna do anything.
Okay, follow. So with shorter option periods, if we represent the buyer, we should attempt to put that second step in the first amendment and then maybe come back.
Well, I don't think you can do that. I don't see how you can do that in the same amendment. You got two different steps. What you'd have to do is have different language. What you would do is you ask for it to be evaluated by, ABC, AC company. And I don't know how you then expand from that and say, and then based on that particular report, the buyer will then, because then the seller's got to know what it is you want me to end up doing and what's it going to cost me. Somehow you're going to have those two steps, I think.
Is that the problem? That's the problem, is the seller doesn't want to agree to replace HVAC.
Oh, no, of course not. Without some,
Knowing what it's going to cost.
yeah, without knowing the cost and without a professional saying, yeah, here's the problem. Because the seller said, it works fine. Okay, it's 15 years old, but it still works fine. I don't know what the problem is. By the way, our AC guy who we've used for years says it's fine. So I don't know what the buyer's problem is. You're exactly right, because the seller's going to not want to expend that money. Tommy Thompson, how are you, sir?
I'm good, sir. How are you doing?
I'm doing really well. And I wanted to give you rebuttal time on some of the concepts we're dealing with.
I just take the word for it.
Okay.
Just do what Bob says. It's easier that way.
So I think now it brings up an important point, though, as you work through this, that you've got to have the time to be able to work through this. And this, by the way, is only a factor when you deal with some fairly complex things where you've got to have something evaluated, maybe a foundation company, roofing, electrical, something like that. And then like that, you've got to be able to do it. In our scenario where the seller gets us at 4:30 on Friday on that last day of the option, says no, not going to do anything. Your challenge now is on the buyer side. Buyer's got to make a decision. Now, if the seller is available, it would appear to me that what would be wise for the buyer to do is try to get the option extended. Give them a little bit more time. And depending on how mad the seller and listing agent are at the buyer for taking so dang long. Of course, then when your mind says, you know what, to make this a really good deal, remember, our original option period was 3 days. So we scramble really hard just to get this done in the 3 days. So please work with us on this. But if you've had 14 days and you're in the last day of the option and you just finally got something to them. Tommy?
And, in this market, if I get a 3 to 5 day option on an offer, I change it to 7. Because there's no way this is going to
I
happen.
need more time, don't they?
It ain't gonna happen. It's not.
It's a benefit to everybody, by the way.
Pardon?
It's a benefit to everybody.
Yeah.
Yep.
Because it's just, wow, that's really, they think they're trying to sell us a bill of goods. They ain't selling us nothing because they're gonna come back and say, oh, we gotta change this.
So having that done up front, I think is a really good thing.
I also think it, just to add a comment, I think it is important if you're a buyer's agent, as soon as you go under contract or even before, you need to get that inspection set up.
Oh, yeah.
And we, as a listing agent, will tell our sellers that as long as everyone is making reasonable and logical efforts to work this out, that if the buyer, if we need a couple of extra days, then we're going to recommend our seller agree to that. It's a measure of, okay, are people working hard? with
Nobody's trying to shaft anybody.
get it done? If somebody's just, as you say, if it's a 14-day option period and they only get one set up until 2 days before, that's a different deal.
Irritates the heck out of everybody. Go, what the heck are you doing? Yeah.
You're showing good faith, I think, to the seller if the buyer gets
What are
there.
you guys finding out there with the inspectors? Are they able to do pretty quick inspections? Or are they really busy and it's hard to schedule, or what are you seeing?
So many are booked.
Yeah, it's
Busy.
hard, yeah. Especially smaller, if it's like we have an inspector that a lot of our clients use, which does a good job, we like him, but
He's always.
we can't use him now because he's booked so far out. So-
Yeah.
But it's difficult.
That's why they pay you the big bucks.
Yeah.
All the checks have her name on
Well,
Smart move.
I know I've signed a couple of those. That's okay.
Wow.
So, on a repair amendment, what's the aha? What are we pulling from our conversation on a repair amendment? What does the buyer need to make sure they do when they request something?
Very clear.
Very
Very clear, so that, because the buyer is going to, because you're the one as the agent who are putting this thing together. You're writing this up. They're trusting you. So when you write it up, you need to have your buyer look at it. Say, that's kind of an interesting way of wording what I wanted to do. I don't think I would have thought of wording it like that. Well, ask me, okay, well, how would you word it? Let's work on this. Let's do something. Let's see what we need to do working through that. But have them look at it, make sure it really is what they think they've agreed to do. And go ahead and say to them, the chances are that the seller won't view this the same way we view it. That people have different interpretations. Now, we know we've got pre-printed text, we've got some of the contract dealing with the obligation of the seller and how they do repairs. They can't do it on their own, personal life, so forth. But we still have the challenge that sellers just go out and do things. We need to make sure we're prepared for that and we follow up and kind of keep going on that. So very clear, and also take your time. Try to get this going as early as possible. Take your time working through it. When we had the panel up here and they were talking about buyers, agents, work through that. One of the great things that Lindsay Knight talked about, one of the our panel members, was a relationship with the agent. How she really worked on that relationship, how that really could make a difference in their offer getting accepted. Same thing on a repair amendment. Be in that conversation with the listing agent. Be sure they understand, here's where we are, kind of to Scott's point, make sure you let them know, here's good effort. We're all trying to work through this. Here's what we're trying to do here. Here's why we couldn't get it done in this time frame and work through that. So you'll have that relationship going and they'll work with you and keep surprises from happening. Shut our hand about a question, or are you just working with your computer? We good? That makes sense? Okay. Yeah, I figured.
Oh, no, I'm just trying to deal with a client right now. I'm so sorry.
So having that relationship and working through it, and make sure that you're on board with it, because if you can keep that relationship going, it makes things happen. As I talk to my broker friends, the number one call that we get from our agents, what do you think the biggest single issue that we have with our agents? Is it their client? Is it the lender? What do you think it is? It's the other agent. It's the other agent. That's the single biggest challenge we have, is with the other agent. When two agents are, one of our agents, bless her, she was really upset. She came to my office. She said, you know what? You know what that person accused me of being? Accused me of being snippy. I smiled and said, well, you're snippy with me, so I think you're not snippy with her. I mean, but that's the single biggest one that we have. And so, those relationships, that working together just makes such a difference. The most effective risk management tool is to be likable. If you're likable, if you guys get along, if your client loves you and work through that, they're not going to sue you. They're not going to file a complaint. Over and over again, I see that proved up. So, two agents working together as professionals, work through it, and try to avoid lecturing them, by the way. Don't go through that process. When they start lecturing you, it's okay, accept it, move on, keep moving forward. Try not to be a little bit condescending anymore. And when the agent says, well, I've been in the business 26 years. Well, they just lied to you. They've been in business 1 year, 26 times, and learned nothing new from that first year. But just smile and say, wow, what an honor for me to work with someone of your experience. I thank you so much for helping me through all this. Just feed their ego and keep right on going. And it'll be to your client's benefit, and then work through it. And we'll move forward. Because one of the realities in this market You know, you may have the seller today and working through the process, be nice to the buyer's agent. Because next week, that buyer's agent may have a property they have listed and you may have a buyer. And you need for that to be a good relationship working through it. So take your time as you're working through on the repair amendment, good, clear and specific, avoid phrases. And remember, we've talked about this a number of times in the contracts themselves and dealing with the issue of things that are not in the contract. That the buyer says, well, because there's certain expectations of the buyer, get the keys, go to the house, it's vacant, it's clean. Nowhere in the contract does it require that. But that's the expectation of the buyer. And you better have the conversation with the buyer and say, to what degree do you want to make sure that happens? And don't ever use the phrase, seller to professionally clean the house. Terrible phrase. I don't even know what that means. What does that mean, professionally clean the house?
And Scott did it.
Scotty, paid Scott.
I'm your guy.
Buyer, if a buyer wants the house clean, buyer needs to state who's going to clean it. Who's the company? Let the seller cap the cost. But this is good for the buyer and the seller because the buyer can't fuss at the seller about how it's clean because their own people did it. And the sellers control the cost. Don't have to seller professionally clean the house. And don't just ask for receipts. Legible paid invoices prior to closing.
Thank you.
Some of this stuff, you can't read it. And, you know, we got these contractors just, you know, work through all this stuff and doing this, and just. But you know, the buyer wants a good receipt. It shows what's been done and it complies with what's been requested and it's all there. You've got it. If you wait till closing, people forget it closing. What are you gonna do? Not close because you didn't get receipts? You work through that.
Bob,
Yes, ma'am.
I think it's just so important in those relationships with the agents to be likable, like you said, but calm. Everybody, now here's
Oh,
what the
glad
buyer
you
is
said that.
asking
Be calm.
for. Yeah, just calm, a conversation.
Be professional.
Be professional. It makes a world.
It's amazing the impact that has on the other side.
It-
When you don't,
Even with someone who's
Yeah.
not calm.
and when you don't take the bait and you be calm, you continue to work through it, at some point in time, they kind of react to it.
Sure.
You're absolutely right, because they're just going ballistic. Now, this gets into the other thing that I talk about on how to hang up on someone. Because you're in a conversation, it's a circular conversation. It's not going anywhere. And you want to get out of the conversation. So somehow, some way, get a word in edgewise. And while you're talking, hang up. I'll never believe you hung up on yourself. That's what I need for. Get out of the conversation. Now, the risk with that is, next time somebody hangs up on you, you say, hey, but in Bob's class. So we have a sense of repairment. Big thing is slow down, take your time, make sure you've done it in such a manner that really those concepts or core concepts are there. Clear and that it's really basic. Yeah, I can see what they're doing there. Now you're good for this other, the next thing, which is not a big deal. It's pretty simple. It's pretty easy. Intermediary. Now, as a precursor to intermediary in a conversation, and we've got a little blurb here that talks about specifically what it is and some of those factors there. What you need to understand about intermediary is that it took a change in the law in Texas, took a change in the statute. The legislature in the 1980s literally had to change the law because before that, a broker could not have opposing clients because a broker owed all the fiduciary duties to their client. And if they also had the other side as a client, there was a conflict. And what do you do with that conflict? How do you address it? The law wouldn't allow a broker to address it. The legislature literally had to change and say, okay, if you the broker, and it's always the broker who's the intermediary, if you the broker are going to represent the buyer and seller in a house transaction, here's how we handle the conflicts. And I have on page in there, I've got the 6 fiduciary duties, which you got in there, about 4 pages down. There's no official list, by the way, of fiduciary duties. These are just the ones that are well accepted by a court and so forth. Some others, some of the track legal courses, they've got some that basically cover these. But the concept is, you've got conflicts there. You know, there's no way you can provide some of those. Full disclosure, for example, is immediate conflict. Loyalty is immediate conflict. Confidentiality is owed to all clients as you work through it. And the legislature had to say, and the courts had to get on board. It took some test cases. We tried, Texas went through a process where they tried dual agency, which is used in a number of states. The number of states in the country that have intermediary is a smaller number than the ones who handle the concept differently. But some of these others had dual agency. We tried dual agency in Texas. We had it in 1990. And it didn't work. Every single suit that we had in Texas, we lost. Because dual agency didn't work. Because the problem with dual agency is you had a broker, that represents a buyer and a seller, and everybody's neutral. No advice or opinion. So you got 2 clients that are kind of left to themselves. And wondering, well, why am I paying you all this money? We can't do anything for it. Didn't work out. So they finally made a compromise, created an intermediary, and established a situation. We now know how we deal with this conflict between AG duties. So when we talk about this right here, on this thing, what is a transaction? Seller represents, the broker represents seller and buyer, house transaction. We haven't gotten to the point about what happens with the agents, but that's the broker. Intermediary is always at the broker level. So in our office, 2 agents in our office, intermediary, like Brody, is always the intermediary. So he's the broker of record for our, behind our corporation. Your license has your name on it, Texas Arpanet Partners Limited. So that's the corporate license we have. So that's always who the intermediary is, and it's when our office represents seller and buyer in house transaction. And they're both clients, and we both owe them duties. It's just what we owe them changes because we've got a conflict between what we can provide for 2 opposing clients. Now, what's required for it to happen? Under the rules of TREC and under the Real Estate License Act and under common law, written consent of the buyer and the seller, or tenant landlord with lease situation, written consent. Now, this brings to us one of the challenges with intermediary. In spite of TREC has all the rules, has the law, TREC doesn't like intermediary. TREC prefers single agency, where the broker represents one client fully. They don't like it when they begin to spread their duties. And one of the things that we get caught on, if we've got an intermediary relationship, even when it's done correctly, the informed consent factor hits us. Because when someone files a claim with TREC and the investigator goes through the process and calls up the parties and gets their information, one of the things that the investigator asks the person to file a complaint. Now, I see here you gave written informed consent. You did it in the listing agreement or by a rep agreement. So you gave permission for the broker to be an intermediary. Did you understand what that was? And almost universally, the complaint would say, no. And the investigator said, well, clearly, if you understood it, we wouldn't be here. The reason that you filed a complaint, you didn't understand what you agreed to. And they don't. And by the way, not only do they not understand it, chances are the agent didn't understand it as you work through the process. The reality is most people view agency answers and questions all money-based. We went through a period in the 90s and early 2000s where we talked about, who paid the commissions who you represented. Well, that was never true. It just kind of felt like, well, it's the money follows the agency. So you're required to have that written consent from the 2 sides and needs to be informed consent. And if something goes south on the deal, you tend to lose the informed consent factor. Kind of creates a different situation. Now, one of the ironies is Trek has the rule, Trek doesn't have the forms. There is no statutory form from the Texas Real Estate Commission in which how we obtain written consent. Those are Texas realtor forms or association forms or broker forms. So while it's important, Trek said, yeah, I got to have this written consent, you're kind of on your own to figure out how to do it. Which to me kind of dilutes their whole requirement. And it's kind of why they don't treat it more seriously than they should. But that's what you got to have. Now, you've got a copy on the next page of one page from a buyer tenant rep agreement. And the language is the same in the listing agreement. And this is the intermediary status. And it's where the client authorized intermediary. And there's kind of an important point in here. When you look there at number 8, intermediary, under intermediary status, where the client, in this case, it's the buyer rep agreement, so the client is the buyer, wants to see the broker's listings and understand the intermediary, and they're going to let who be an intermediary? Broker. And you might want to bring them in here and let them meet Mike, since he's going to be the intermediary. No. But if they're not going to authorize an intermediary, look what they've agreed to under 8B. Client does not wish to be shown or acquire any broker's listings. You got a buyer who doesn't agree to intermediary, you can't show them any buyer listings. That's probably not what the buyer was thinking. You know, we got lots of listings. Oh no, I don't see your listing. I just want to see Remax listings, C21 don't be showing you. In fact, you probably won't even understand the other Keller Williams. It's not an intermediary, but yeah, we probably shouldn't see theirs too. Probably too many. But that's what if they don't authorize the intermediary, that's what they're agreeing to. So it's a real challenge. But this is how you get the authorization. Same thing in the listing agreement. You work through that, essentially the same language. Go back to our steps here. The approval process from the broker for intermediary. Because in intermediary, as we look at number 4, is we've got some appointment options. And 2 pages over, you see the intermediary relationship notice form that addresses the appointment process. The broker is the intermediary, and the broker gets to decide, okay, one of my agents has a listing, one of my other agents has a buyer client. That buyer client wants to buy that listing, that's intermediary. We've got proper authorization in the listing agreement, buyer representation agreement. And so our policy is, our brokerage says to you 2 agents, listing agent, buyer rep agreement. Our automatic process is you, the listing agent, will be appointed to represent the seller. You, the buyer's agent, will be appointed to represent the buyer. And you'll complete this form, intermediary relationship notice form, showing broker will appoint listing agent in the first blank, buyer's agent in the second blank. And so that's the process. As long as you're doing it with appointments, you automatically have that authority to complete this and put the names in, and you represent the buyer. You're going to have your buyer sign off on this, and you're going to send this along with the offer, because you need to do this notification of appointments as soon as possible as you work through that. And so the broker, in our policy, we've already approved that if we have intermediary with 2 agents in place, one represents seller, the other represents buyer, you complete this, you have the authority to do this. You don't have to call Mike up and say, Mike, okay, we've got an intermediary thing. I need for you to appoint. You're going to appoint? You're going to appoint me? He doesn't do it. It's automatic. It's already done. It's in our policy. It's in our policy procedures manual. It's in our intranet under our agency policy. So it's there. So you're done. If we've got 2 agents in place. Question on that so far? So you don't have to have any approval from anybody else. It's already there. It's automatic. If you're in that way. Now, what are the appointment options for the broker? And by appointment, we mean the broker making a decision who's going to represent which client. In the License Act and the rules of TREC, it establishes that a broker may appoint one agent to represent one party, such as seller, and another separate agent to represent the buyer. Or the broker can choose to not appoint anyone. Broker has that choice. That's under the law. It then becomes a broker policy issue. Under our AG policy, we have the information in there that says, here's the process we go through to approve the circumstance and firm up the broker's decision whether or not we're going to appoint somebody representing the seller, somebody representing the buyer. By the way, the broker under the law can never appoint him or herself. That's because that would create a conflict. You can't both be the broker and represent a client at the same time. It's a conflict you can't pass. So the law does not allow that. So the broker has to do it. And if you're going to make any appointments, it has to be at least two agents. You have to have one for one side, another for the other side. You can have an uneven number, by the way. You can have the listing agent who's extremely experienced, very sophisticated, very knowledgeable, and the buyer has an agent who's brand new and doesn't know a lot. The broker could appoint two agents to represent the buyer and have that one agent on the listing side represent the seller. So there's no rule that prohibits that. And that's all in the rules of trade to establish that. So if the broker has to make a decision, our process is, if you, and we talked about the timing of it here, if you have a situation in which you feel like you want to represent the seller and the buyer in house transaction, we do not prohibit that. Although that's the rap I get. You talk to any of our broker friends in the area. What's Bob's policy on non-appointed situation? Oh, he doesn't allow that. Oh, I can't even believe you're asking about that. It's not our policy. We do not prohibit it. I don't like it. I highly discourage it. And I want a really good story from you on why you want to do it. And I want you to be able to show me that you understand it. More importantly, the two clients understand, because you still have two clients. It wouldn't be an intermediary if we didn't have two clients. You've got one client, one customer, you don't have intermediary. You got two clients, you got intermediary. And so the concept is, when you first see there's a possibility that, number one, you could have intermediary. Number two, a decision has to be made about appointments. You need to know that we give you that authority to start the process at the very beginning about which way you want to go, what you recommend. But the process is you've got to talk to Jill or Mike or me. It's not an automatic approval like it is with two agents in place. You have to get approval from management. And what you're going to need to be able to do is say, okay, I represent the seller, and here's why I want to make the buyer a client also. You need to have a good explanation for that. Because here's our challenge. You see the next page where it has the concept of fiduciary duties. You took the listing. You sold the seller on your advocacy, on your ability to negotiate on their behalf, on your ability to take care of them all the way through the process, give them advice and opinion. And all of a sudden, through no fault of their own, because a buyer, maybe a buyer client you had from before, but a buyer comes along and you're going to represent this buyer, all of a sudden, these duties you had, these fiduciary duties you had to the client, to the seller client, change dramatically. The big change is no more advice or opinion. Just went away.
Bob,
Yes, sir.
what's a Bob Baker approved explanation? An example.
Okay, so here's the most common one. Our agent had the listing, it was an investment property. Our agent had the buyer client, investor. Our agent had a relationship with both sides, long-term relationships. And the two choices, because they both were clients, they both were our rep listing or had that. The two choices were either moving forward with two clients and the agent making sure the two clients understood no advice or opinion, and both sophisticated investors, you know what, we just need to get the paperwork. Don't worry about it. We can handle it. And everybody agreed to move forward. So either that choice or change one of them from client to customer. Now, when you change someone and you change the agency relationship from client to customer, there's always a risk. Because one of the things that a client gets that a customer does not get is confidentiality. And it's a possibility that this buyer who was a client, who's now going to be a customer, so they won't be an intermediary, will not understand, well, I told you this thing while I was still a client, so that's confidential. And he said, no, you told it to me the next day when you were a customer, so it was no longer confidential. Chances of them really understanding that are pretty slim. So it's a risk when you change from client to customer. But that was one of the options. So in a case like that, where you've got them convinced, they've got you convinced, we're sophisticated, we don't want to break in another agent right now, we've got a long-term relationship that we hope to continue. It's generally an investment situation. The cases where you've got the listing and the buyer says, I don't need an agent. I'll represent myself. I don't need anybody screening for you. No intermediary, seller, client, buyer, customer. What you'll find is too often the buyer really does not capable of representing themselves. You have to figure out some way to kind of address and deal with that. But to just, if you don't already have an agent relationship in place, both buyer and seller, it's an incredibly rare, it's 1 in 1,000 situations where it makes sense to make that other side a client. They either have the ability to represent themselves, stay a customer, or they don't. If they need help, you can't help them because you represent the seller. And if you took him on as a client, both the seller and the buyer lost all advice and opinion. And your seller sitting there going, wow, I'm paying you 6% for all this advocacy because you're going to get 3% to the other side. I find out there is no other side. It's you. The whole thing is you. And all of a sudden you can't help me anymore. Why am I paying you that money? It's hard to justify the commission because it's hard to justify the fact they just lost through no fault of their own your advice and opinion. Hard to justify that. Really is. And it's mostly because they don't understand it. Now, the variables are endless of how this can work through. What I need for you to stay through is a concept. Because vast majority of the time, easily 90% of the time, you don't already have two client relationships. That certainly does happen. You've got a buyer client you've taken on, you've been working with them. Maybe you've already worked with them, a couple probably didn't work out. And all of a sudden a new listing that you've got the perfect one. Which is what I do now. I got a buyer client, I got a seller client. What I would encourage you to do is, especially if your buyer client continues to need some advice and opinion, or the seller client needs advice and opinion, bring in another one of our agents for that specific transaction. That way, we get intermediary, we get advice and opinion to each client because they each authorize intermediary, negotiate a flat fee kind of arrangement with that other agent. You're not giving up the whole 3% like that, some other amount. And if it doesn't work out on this specific transaction, you get the buyer back as you work through that process. So I encourage you rather than move, because remember, when you have a conversation, most times you got the listing in and buyer pops up. You have a conversation with the buyer, and the conversation has to be, do they need help or not? If they need help, it can't be you. Is everybody comfortable with why it can't be you? Can't help them. If they don't need help, try to help them go through as a customer. Now, even though they just lied to you, by the way, and they did, they gave a money answer to an agent question. Oh, no, we don't need any more agents. We don't need you. Just you is fine. Because they know they're going to be able to save some money. You know, that 3% you're going to pay back, I don't know, sales price reduction, or I want the money or whatever. And your first hint that they really need help is when they can't write the offer. And they're not sure about the forms. And we all know when we sit down with a client and we're working up an offer, we understand all the advice and opinion issues. One, which contract form you use, which addendums you're going to include in it. What do we do in paragraph 6C? Do we include 1, 2, or 3? How many days do we put in? All those are advice and opinions. You go through that process. So when you're sitting here working through it, and this buyer says, well, we represent ourselves and we do need some help in this. Well, TREC allows a number of things. No advice or opinion, but Trex says, one of the things that we like to do, or I like to do, is what I call a reverse offer, where you work up an offer from the seller's perspective. Here's what the seller would like. Here's the price seller would like. Here are the choices in the contract form seller would like. Here's all that. Complete that. Don't have your seller sign it. Complete it. Give it to the buyer. Says, here's what the seller would like to do. You read it. You see if you want to do that too, or if you want to make some changes, do that. That gets them moving. That gets them kind of going through the process. Now, if you don't do that, the buyer says, well, okay, I've got the contract form. I'm not sure. I mean, for example, how many days should I put in 6C1 for the existing survey? And you say, well, here's what the seller would like. Seller's got one, and here's the timeline the seller would like. Or you may say, well, you know what? Seller doesn't have an existing survey, and seller's not going to pay for a new one. So you need to look at maybe changing that to 6C2, where you're going to buy a new survey because seller's not going to do it. So all those answers you give, here's what the seller wants, or here's what's normal in the neighborhood. For example, say, how much earnest money should I put up? Well, here's the norm in the marketplace. Here's what we're seeing for this price range in this neighborhood, and consider the nature of this market. We used to be 1%. We're seeing more like 2%. We're seeing different kinds of things. So you can give those kinds of answers. You can even recommend and give them a number of 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 lenders. They say, well, we know we're well qualified. We've gone online. Anyway, you go through that process. So you have any lenders you like to work with? Now, remember, your seller can require a buyer to be qualified by a lender the seller feels comfortable with. Can't make them use them. But you say, you know what? I want an opinion from a lender the seller I'm comfortable with. I want to know what they think about you. So here's what the seller do. And you can give them a list of things. Now, you're going to have them complete that vendor statement policy form. So we give that because we're not endorsing. We're not saying, yeah, here's somebody you ought to use. Same conversation on title companies, on inspectors, on all those. Trex says, yeah, you can provide that information as long as they understand you're not saying here's what you have to do. But you can do all those things. Your risk as you go through that is if you step over the line a little bit and they walk away from it feeling like you've just advised them. Because if in the Trex complaint or in the lawsuit, their answer to the question is, I wasn't really sure what to do. Thank goodness the agent told us how to make that work and how to do that and gave us all that good advice. It was really helpful. We're in trouble. But you can't do that to a customer. You can't go down that road. It's just like your seller, you're not going to help your seller complete that seller disclosure notice. There's a reason it says seller's disclosure notice. Larry, you have a question? Looks like an answer. Okay. Does that make semi-sense? Because what I want us to walk away from this feeling, like on the question of you representing both buyer and seller, you need to really have had the strong conversations about why this might even happen. And you understand we don't prohibit it, but there's a process. We'd like for you to go through the process. We'd like for you to have the conversation with me or Mike or Jill, whoever's available. And you probably already know this, but I will own up to the fact that your conversation with me will probably be a little more expanded than it might be with Mike or Jill. Just because I have feelings about this.
No way.
But it's okay. And remember, and the thing I mentioned earlier, my feelings on this are not arbitrary. And it's not because I said so. I've been down the road too many times. I've got a challenge right now. It's out of Rockwall, fortunately for us here, but it's not for me because that's my license anyway. And we've got an intermediary, and we did it exactly right. One agent represents the seller, one agent represents the buyer. But both sides see Keller Williams Rockwall on both sides. And when it went south, they say, well, this is your problem. This is Keller Williams Rockwall needs to fix this. And that's what happens. People look at situations, and when they see Keller Williams Plano on both sides, they figure anything that happens, they're in total control, they can fix it. They are responsible for it. Now, ironically, this happens between Keller Williams offices. When they see, we've got one right now where, we've got, I think in that situation, we got the buyer, and the buyer sees sellers represented by Keller Williams, actually DPR. And it says, this is not working out well. I'm not really happy with the fact that we got Keller Williams there too. Not intermediary, two totally different offices, but they see the brand on both sides. It could be Remax, C21 and Keller Williams, but they have this tendency to pull both of them together and say, you guys are kind of in control of everything. Well, we're not. But there's that basic misunderstanding of that. And when you take that basic misunderstanding and you pull it down to the concept of one agent in the middle, even two agents in the middle, you've expanded on the challenges. And you just need to be very, very careful. Now, there's good news about intermediary, particularly intermediary with two agents. The chances of you having a problem in that transaction are much, much smaller because you're dealing with two agents who are well-trained. Because the agent on the other side in our office is well-trained just as you are, and the chances are the transaction is going to be a good transaction. You both understand relationships, you understand what you're doing, you understand how to make things work. So chances are in an intermediary with two agents in our office, it's going to be a good transaction. Because frankly, we know what we're doing. We're good at it. We're well-trained. So I say, that's the good news about that intermediary in our office. But, when I talk to my broker friend, one of them who's the broker for the largest franchise in the state, and he talks about it, and he says, it just drives me to drink. He says, because every time it happens, we're responsible, totally. Of course, he doesn't have the benefit that we have. All these people are not well-trained. He's got too many. Got like 1,800. And it's just too many. And he can't make sure they're all well-trained. He said, when something goes south, he had one that we have, conversation about, he had both sides of it. And he said, Bob, my problem is I tried to fix it. I realized we were wrong, which is totally screwed up in this deal. And as a result of it, it's going to cost us money. But you get to that point. We have that happen much less here because we're good. Know what we're doing. And I want you to understand that. I want you to be able to work off of it, and our clients benefit from it enormously. Past this, you've got the agency policy, which is a reference thing for you. Kind of explains to it, here's how all that works, here's what we do. And I really need for everyone to be really comfortable, and comfort maybe too strong a word, I don't know. With the fact we don't prohibit intermediary with one agent in the middle. There's just a process. Everybody comfortable with that? There's a process to work through it. And I just want you to be able to come to a good conversation and say, now, your conversation may start off, by the way, you may not even have to get to Mike and Jill and I. You may start off on our hotline. Call Scott or Marcia, or Joe in the situation, or Nick McCoy. And when they call you and they say, we've got this possibility intermediary, what do you think? They may say, well, let's have some conversations, have some questions about it. Have you thought about this? Have you thought about that? And it may get resolved at that level because, they understand it, they understand how it works. And they say, you know what? We all understand Bob and his attitude, so maybe we can get it fixed out here. Whatever Bob. But do that, and as you work through it, and I think you'll find that it works out well. Good news is it's pretty rare. Doesn't have a lot. I don't need for this to be a thing that you focus on a lot. It's just not worth it. You work through that. So, questions on that? As we work through it, you guys have been quieter than normal, and that worries me a little bit. Oh, Bob, nothing we're talking about, I'm really excited about. So let's talk about something.
I'll ask a question.
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, so I know I learned this and I don't remember what it was. The sub-agent.
Yeah.
I've heard in Champions a long time ago, the instructor, I don't remember who it was, said that never ever do that. People don't understand. You can't do that. It shouldn't do that. It doesn't work.
You know what it is?
I don't know
Explain
what
to
it
you.
is.
We're going to explain to you what it is. Your sub-agency. We have a seller. The agent with another company has a buyer customer. And the buyer customer is made very clear. I'm not going to have representation. I'll represent myself. You're my agent. I agree with that. I'm using you just to get into the house, right and off, but I represent myself. Well, one of the rules in Texas, if you're doing anything that requires a license, you have to represent somebody. I mean, you do. So this agent working with this buyer customer has got a problem. He's got to find a client. He's got to represent somebody. And so he may call the listing agent and say, you know what? I've got a buyer interested in your listing and got a problem with it. Won't let me be his agent. So I'd like to be a sub-agent of you and of the seller. What that'll mean is that agent in another company fully represents that seller and that brokerage at every level. Now, the problem is that agent in that RE/MAX office is not the only one who represents our seller. So does their broker. And so does every agent in that office. Now, if you've got another agent in that office operating under sub-agency who has a buyer client who wants to make an offer on that same property. We got seller client, sub-agent in that RE/MAX office over there, buyer agent with a buyer client in the office, both making offers. There's no agent relationship for that in Texas. It's not an intermediary. There's no recognized agent relationship. It's a lawsuit or a track and plain living place. In a marketplace where you have buyer agency and seller agency, have both of those, sub-agency does not work. It's horrendous because it's not just the agent, it's the whole company moves over to sub-agency and represents that side. Now, the challenge we've had for a long time, people are getting a little better at it, is people would say, well, you know that if the agent doesn't have a buyer rep agreement with buyer, then he automatically represents seller. It's not true. That is not true. There is nothing automatic about agency. You don't get to automatic. And so what we're saying is because you automatically represent seller, so you're a sub-agent. Sub-agent does not accidentally happen. It has to be offered and accepted. But that's a belief. For a long time, people said, if you don't represent the buyer, you represent the seller. It's automatic. No. Yeah, it was true before intermediary came along, before buyer agent came along. When I first got into the business in the 60s and 70s, everybody did represent the seller. That was how it was. Now, not because why they thought, well, that's who pays the commission. Well, that wasn't why we represent the seller. The reality is the seller was the only client in the whole transaction. And back in the 60s and 70s, we couldn't even spell agency. We didn't know what it was. So we're just doing deals, selling houses. But later when we finally understood it better, because the attorneys all of a sudden picked up on and said, whoa, this is a gold mine. Let's start going after all these realtors who don't understand agency and doing it wrong. And that's exactly why we had to end up work through this. But sub-agency, can't do it in our marketplace. Can't do it. And we would never do it. We would never allow it. We would never accept it. The only time it would ever semi-possibly be feasible, the buyer is working with an agent in a very small company. The whole company's like 5 agents. And they don't have a bunch of stuff going on. And then their broker is okay with, to make it, it's a really good deal and the buyer don't even represent it. And the broker over here with this other small company, I know him really well, and we're okay doing that. It's about the only time it could even happen. They have to be really negotiated. Conversation have to happen. The rest agree to it, but otherwise subbation doesn't happen.
I always see a 3 in that spot.
And see, that's the other misunderstanding.
Yeah.
People think that when they see 3 there, that it means the listing agent is offering up sub-agent. That's not what the rules say. That's the rule. All the Netris rules say is what the listing agent is saying is if sub-agent were to happen, here's what I would pay a sub-agent. It doesn't mean I'm offering sub-agency. Just like the 3% BAC, I'm only offering up 3% BAC if in fact you are the buyer's agent. If you're not the buyer's agent, I don't owe you 3%. So it's not an offering of sub-agency, but that's perception.
Okay.
That's how a lot of people think of it as. So it's just not that kind of thing. Good question. Anything else? You make me feel rejected. You don't have a lot of great. How about my Zoom folks? You got anything? Any questions? I can't believe, James, you haven't come up with something. You always come up with something.
You answered my questions today. No.
Hey, Bob, I have one last
Yes,
one.
ma'am.
Intermediary, when you
Uh-huh.
have a lease and you are representing the landlord, can you then get the tenant application in and have both sides?
Well, you're not going to represent the tenant.
Correct?
That'd be like representing the seller and buyer as one
Right.
agent in the middle.
Does that require your permission?
Yes. If you're going to represent two sides, whether it's a lease or a sale, you need to get our permission. Because you have the same problem. All of a sudden, no advice or opinion. Now, it's generally not a big deal in a lease situation. The tenant probably didn't really need for you to represent them, and you probably are okay doing it. But you need to understand, the tenant probably should just be a customer. Don't take them on as a client. And I'm glad you brought that part up, because there's another case that sometimes happens, which you have the buyer client and it's a for sale by owner property. If you got that, you'll use the TAR 2401 registration agreement between broker and owner, which you register your buyer on the first page and you establish the agency on the second page, showing that you represent the prospect only. Don't take that seller on as a client, because you would then be that one agent in the middle representing both sides, and your buyer would just have lost all your advocacy, all your advice and opinion, all your ability to advise them getting through this transaction on for sale by owner. For sale by owner has already made the decision to represent themselves. That's kind of the decision. They want to save some money, do that. That's fine. You want to do it, use that form. Make sure you give them the seller an information about broker services form and work through that process, but don't take both sides on. I used the phrase 1 in 1,000 to be 1 in 10,000 for you to take both sides on in a sale by owner. Just don't do it. So a good question in there, Laura. So all intermediary, all agency applies to both seller, buyer, landlord, and tenant. Same rules apply across the board for both of them. Good question. Anything else? Guys, you've been great. I appreciate it. The other thing is I hope all of you have the information on the services for Charles tomorrow night and Saturday. I know we want to support the family by having good attendance and work through the process. We're just heartbroken. Thank all of you very much. I appreciate you being here. And go out and represent buyers or sellers. The last piece of